Yeah, thank you very much, Kathleen, for that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you to that session for the project with an interesting acronym called DiBiHo, Digitale Bildungsnachweise in Hochschulen in German, and in English, digital credentials for higher education. After we listened to all this talk, to all those interesting talks that we heard for the first half of the day, I probably could have omitted half of the introduction. And I just want to point out a couple linking points where we can directly link our project and our efforts from the past 2 years to. So, for example, Professor Teubner from the TU Berlin this morning, he talked in his very last seconds about forged credentials, and forged paper credentials in particular are one of the main reasons or the motivation for our project. And then Mrs. Wenger from the ECE took up that point and told us, for example, about Coffin's journey, how his application process is complicated because he had 3 schools and 3 different types of credentials which had to be received through 3 different means of communication. And then also Professor Kratzer from the TU Berlin opened up that whole journey of micro-credentials and smaller content than the traditional educational credentials. And then just an hour ago in the panel, we talked about trust and skills which are built along the journey of lifelong learners. And this is kind of more or less where I want to jump in. So, slight word in advance about our project. We were a consortium project of the TU Munich, the Hasso-Plattner Institute, and the DAAD. And as you can see, our project is about to end this month, apparently. And we were wondering, or we tackled the goal of digital credentials for higher education, and how we did this and what kind of the key findings are is where we're going to be now. So, as I wanted to link to, we have this journey of lifelong learning. Today, learning does not end with the school. You can go in, you can do online courses, you can do other kind of like free time certifications, and all that needs to be accredited. All that is something you probably want to share to an employer in the course of an application. And then particularly besides having your credential and, for example, going to school and to university in Berlin and then applying for a job in Berlin, you have this whole bigger picture of student mobility. So people are not located anywhere in one place anymore. They move, they travel. We heard interesting talks about the challenges of acknowledging certificates from other countries. And so this is an increasingly tedious process, and we have a manual, state-of-the-art analog process which is currently in place, and that process needs to be transformed to a digital form. And what we also need to keep in mind is that transforming a process into its digital form does not only mean we replace a paper document with a PDF document, but we have a whole new landscape of possibilities just by being able to dive into the digital world, which we need to also use to provide a proper digital process. So for our priorities for the project, we're exploring a trustworthy, distributed and interoperable infrastructure, because earlier we heard that there's many standards out there and everybody's trying to do his own standard, and every standard solves 1 or 2 problems. And we wanted to have a look at this international infrastructure which is interoperable throughout all the standards. So particularly the international perspective, we wanted to have a look at, or we had a look at existing approaches, about shortcomings, also benefits of the approaches. We wanted to have a proper requirement analysis from and with stakeholders of the credential systems, and also design and implement prototypes for different use cases, and then finish up the project by basically providing recommendations for the next steps moving forward, which is kind of the phase in which we are right now in the project. Our international context is picked up by our participation in the Digital Credentials Consortium, which is kind of an international consortium to foster digital credentials, and we also have or will have the presentation about the learner wallet from the DCC. And the core goals are that it's a learner-centered and standards-based and use case-driven. So often standards are developed without use cases in mind, and we just hope that they fit for whichever goal. What we did in the beginning of the project, so basically 1.5 years ago, was we had a big user workshop organized particularly through the DAAD, much thanks to that for our project partners, and in which we basically talked to stakeholders from throughout the world, stakeholders from public administrations, from higher education institutions, who then basically told us about what their challenges are and what they deem to be particularly important for a digital credential landscape. Out of this, we developed kind of our design rationales and our core requirements, and one of which stood out was the user-centered data management, which somehow falls into the category of self-sovereignty, which we also heard earlier today, and that the system needs to be free of charge for learners in particular. So which learner is going to accept and adopt a system for which he has to pay hundreds of dollars whenever he wants to show his credential? And then all the information about the learner shall be available to himself. We also heard like snippets into that direction earlier today. And the authentication, so one core criteria was that we keep security goals in mind, because 50 years ago, with the dawn of the internet, we observed that internet was created without particular security goals, and now we are here today, and everything we try to do today to improve security of the infrastructure itself is way harder than if we had thought about it in advance. So we wanted to keep this in mind like from the get-go of the project. And furthermore, obviously, in terms of data protection, learner data must not be used for secondary purposes, and data minimization is key, and the learner is supposed to be in control of that data. And that basically brought us to a big document of about 50 functional requirements, a couple of non-functional requirements, spanning our 3 use cases from our 3 partner institutions. So the MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses, for us at Hasso-Plattner Institute, the diplomas for the TU Berlin, and then, the TU Munich, sorry Felix, and then the use case of the scholarship for the DAAD. And yeah, this is kind of where we start into the project, and now I would gladly hand over to Alexander to get started into our prototype.
Yeah, thank you for this introduction to the first phase of our project. I'll go now a bit more in depth into the architecture, the design choices and implementation considerations that we took during the second phase, where we were developing the proof of concept. So let's step back a bit for this and look at the digital credential lifecycle as we envision it. And this lifecycle really starts at the interaction between the issuer and the learner. Right? The learning institution wants to attest to a certain claim about the learner, for example, his student status, his successful completion of a degree, or other learning achievements. The learner then, in turn, also wants to independently use this received data and present it to, for example, relying parties for it to be used in further processes, such as a job application, maybe change of university, or other further learning paths. This claim still needs to be verifiable, and this is where this concept of a trusted data registry comes in, where information about identifiers of the participants and also the continued status of the claim is being held. So as you've seen, the user really is in the center of all these interactions between the parties in this lifecycle as we envision it. And this is by design, right? We chose for the proof of concept to have self-sovereign identity as a design principle, which we see as an evolution of user-centric identity. And we aim, through this design principle, to give the user control over that claim data, which should in turn enable a high mobility of data in the ecosystem. This was first popularized by Christoph in 2016 and has really been fueled by this hype surrounding blockchain. And while a lot of the early prototypes and pilots have utilized blockchain technology, in SSI, we see it more as a design principle rather than being tied to one specific implementation choice. So if I'm talking about something like the trusted data registry in the previous slide, then we really see this more as an abstract infrastructure without making, at least for now, we'll talk about the specific implementations of what we chose later on, to have certain information available for querying and verification. Yeah, there have been some important standardization efforts already in this space. I'll name two which are core to the proof of concept that we developed. They've mainly been pushed by the World Wide Web Consortium. And on the one hand, we have decentralized identifiers, which allow for globally unique identification. And what is important to say here is that it works more as an interoperability layer for different identification implementations. Right? This resolution from an identifier to cryptographic key material that can be used in an interaction for signing of documents and things like this can be done with various methods. You can use something like a centralized web server where you can get the information. You can use something like a smart contract or any other newfangled technology that you might create tomorrow. But it is important to say that it allows for free choice, not only of technology, but also of the provider. And through this interoperability layer, all of these different choices can coexist in one ecosystem. On the other hand, we also have verifiable credentials, which really give a standardized scaffolding, like a general structure on how to make claims about an entity verifiable. So from a technical standpoint, it would be something like a JSON document that has the three main parts of a metadata, something like the issuer and receiver, also the claim, but I always stress that this claim in a VC is typically of arbitrary content and structure. So the standard is not that much concerned about something like the learner model or other structures of the claim itself, but rather how a generic claim can be made verifiable. And here the third part, the proof, comes in, where cryptographic means such as signatures are used for it to be made provably verifiable. Yeah, so the first question that we had to ask ourselves when developing the proof of concept, now that we have these first core parts, this framework that we can use, we can take a data object of a claim, put it in this standardized envelope, and have a digital credential. But what do we actually want to issue? And as learning institutions, obviously our primary goal is, as Daniel has mentioned before, a diploma in the university use case and records of achievements or attendance and similar things at the massive open online courses. So we have, on the one hand, VCs attesting to learning achievements, and here, although W3C with the verifiable credentials does not have strong requirements for the data object that you put into it, there are a number of very promising and interesting projects that do try to develop these standards, such as ELM in the European context, that can be used here in this ecosystem as well. However, to enable this primary goal of issuing learning achievements, we also have this secondary goal, which might not be intuitive to a university or to a learning institution, and that is identity attributes of the learner. So especially in high-profile cases such as diplomas or other high-risk certificates, there is a need oftentimes to have a very strong link between the learning achievement and the real-life identity. So something like the name, birthday, birthplace, etc. is required. So how did we implement this? If we take an example of such an achievement credential, we can see we have different information about the achievement itself, the course, what was actually achieved. This was a confirmation of participation, what was required for it to be successfully completed. But the identification of the learner here is actually done through the decentralized identifiers that I mentioned earlier that have been standardized by the W3C. And these really are not much more than a pseudonym. So it is cryptographically provable for the holder of the credential to prove that he has ownership of it. However, there are no strong guarantees for the actual real-life identity that is behind this identifier. So if we would require, as a relying party, I want to show my achievement credential, but I also require for you to reveal your name, this could be easily solved if we just write my name, Alexander Mühle, here next to the cause and the achievement. However, in the spirit of data minimization, which is one of the principles behind self-sovereign identity, this would not be in our design guidelines. So what we did instead is that during the issuance of the achievement credential, we create this additional field in the credential which has information about the learner, however, not something that is straight away revealable. And only on demand, if it is actually required by the relying party, we can provide another credential. In this case, we call it the identity credential, which holds the information of my real-life identity, such as the name, the birthplace, or birth date. And one of the advantages here is also that this can be really a separation of purposes and of jobs, right? Not necessarily as OpenHBI, we want to be responsible for guaranteeing the real-life identity behind one of the users, but rather this could be done by an established identity provider, a national EID system, or something similar. And this already transitions well into the next point. After we know what we want to issue, we have to ask ourselves, where do we get this data from? And universities and company systems already have quite an elaborate infrastructure where they are managing student information, HR, software, and similar things in the verification context. And in quotations, this would only need to be connected to this new credential infrastructure. But as it turns out, oftentimes this is not as easy as you would hope. Yeah, so to quickly recap also a bit what Daniel said, what do we actually issue in the 3 different use cases? The identification documents we issue from both the HBI and the TU Munich. As universities, we already have existing student information systems with user management. The course certificates are being issued by MOOCs, and the diplomas with the attachments from the University of TU Munich. And all of these different issued documents can then be used during the scholarship application, which is our verification use case at the DAAD. Yeah, so how do we get to these different data sources? Well, the first one that we looked at, right before we can talk about any learning achievements of learners, we need to know who these learners are. And for universities, there are already quite well-established onboarding processes. You might remember when you first came to university, you had to maybe go to an administrative office. It would have probably been quite bureaucratic. You show a physical ID, someone checks that you are actually who you are, you say. But at the end of whatever this process looks like, a new data entry is created, and you become a new data entry into a user directory. And these user directories are quite well connected. There are common protocols to access this data and use it in a single sign-on use case, Shibboleth, SAML, OIDC. And this is also what we tapped into for the credential issuer to take the data and trigger the issuance process. The same or very similar interfaces could be leveraged with OpenHBI, the MOOC platform of HBI, where we are getting the achievement data from. I will get back that in a bit. And for the diploma data, unfortunately, it was not as easy as having a common protocol such as OIDC or an API that is accessible with OpenHBI, but rather we had to create a new watchdog application, which was basically monitoring the attached database to the TUM Online student information system and watch for changes in the status of a learner, for example, or the completion of a degree. And once these were detected, the issuance process would be triggered. And so we have different data sources now that all basically feed into this generalized VC issuance. And this VC issuance can actually be done by standardized components. There are also common interfaces that are being in the process of being standardized, such as VC API. So we could develop an issuer service compliant to this interface that could handle further design considerations, such as revocation methods, the handling of the issuer identity, and similar things, which we will talk about a bit later on in the presentation. And then to connect all of these different data sources and to really be extendable, we created a middleware for these different data sources for it to be reusable between different institutions and also between different use cases. So the identity, we first implemented OIDC, OpenID Connect. Obviously, this could then also be extended to other protocols. Records of achievements, we're using the OpenHBI Bridge API. This is also actually standardized over the family of OpenHBI platforms, so other platforms such as eGov Campus, OpenSAP, OpenWHO or similar could also leverage this kind of technology quite quickly with very few changes. And for the diploma, as I've mentioned, TUM Online Watchdog was the data source to create the VCs for the VC API. What actually happens then after the issuance process has been triggered? The standardized service of the issuer service gives out a verifiable credential. Well, now finally the user is in control of their credential again. So we give them the possibility to either use it as just another document. You have a file that you can store at your will. You can put it in your Dropbox, put it on a pen drive, or you could interact with it with a specialized wallet such as Enmeshed. You can see the QR code that you can scan and then import the credentials. However, if we as a user actually want to present these claims about us, it is actually not appropriate to simply send the verifiable credentials, but rather we have to create a verifiable presentation out of the verifiable credentials. And what this means is that we can take, for example, also multiple of these VCs, combine them. So if we take the example that we had before, we could take an identity credential and an achievement credential, bundle them together, and then sign them from the learner. And this allows, or this provides, on the one hand, proof that the party that I'm interacting with actually is the holder and owner of the credentials, and also ensures something like the learner intent and has some security properties such as replay protection. But this also means that it's not as simple for the user to simply take the raw files, put it in an email, send it somewhere else. No, you actually need a multiple step process. So you would take the credential wallet where you have your credentials, put them to another wallet where you have your cryptographic material and send it further. This is actually not very usable, and as we know, if something is not usable, either the user will not even use it or will use it improperly. So this is where the Learner Credential Vault comes in. As Daniel has said before, we are part of the Digital Credential Consortium and have worked together with them to develop this learner wallet, which enables really a simple way to interact with your credentials and take care of not only the management, but also the creation and interaction for presenting to relying parties. It is a smartphone application. This means probably all of you have access to it. It is also open source, so if you want to check it out or maybe even use at your own projects, feel free. Yeah, so the workflow now is much more simplified rather than having to coordinate between different wallets, different applications, where the interfaces are often not well defined. We actually have one learner credential wallet which combines the features of the credential DID wallet. If we are a relying party where, for example, we want to verify a bachelor degree because someone is applying to a master degree, then we present them with a QR code. This QR code can then be scanned by the wallet, and the wallet guides the user through the process of selecting the appropriate credentials for this use case, and then also takes care of cryptographically signing it and sending it to the relying party. How this protocol actually looks like, we will go into a bit later on. Yeah, so I will now hand over to Felix, who will go a bit more into the actual proof of concept and hands-on demos.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's exactly what we're going to do, take a bit more of a concrete look at what a system like this entails in practice. and go a bit through our prototype artifacts to give you some better overview. So of course, naturally, the very first problem you encounter is, how is this issuance triggered? Alexander has already talked a bit about this, and TUM, for example, for diplomas, it's an implicit process. When you enroll, you consent to, of course, receive your diploma. In a legal context, you have to receive your diploma, actually. So it is all done in the background and completely hidden from anyone, be it administrative staff or students. And at the HPI, for MOOCs, you have more control about this. So you can actually choose the point at which you want to have your credential issued. And you can also, which is what you can see here, choose the attributes this credential should contain. So then when it is finally created, you're prompted with the QR code, and that is how you take out the credential out of the system and into your wallet app of choice, which could, for example, be the Learner Credential Wallet we have just seen. So this is how it looks like at TUM and at HPI. So at TUM, you do not actually start the issuance process yourself, but once your diploma would be created after you have finished your degree, you will receive a reminder email that your degree is now also retrievable in digital form online, and then you can enter the standard student portal and are presented with a QR code similar to what we have here on the HPI side. So in both cases, you just take your smartphone, scan the code, and this should hopefully make the system very intuitive and very accessible also. We've talked about this a bit on the entry day yesterday, for example. Not everyone has access to a computer, so this protocol can also fully run on the phone. So yeah, here just a quick overview of the wallet. You just open it up, you tap on scan QR code, you scan the code, and then you are prompted with this overview of the credential or multiple credentials you just received. Can quickly make sure everything is in order, you get what you expect to get, and accept it into your wallet. So next up, now that we have seen how you can get your credentials as a learner, I want to talk a bit more about the other side and show you a bit about verification. So once you have your credentials, yeah, you will of course probably store them for a while. All of that happens in your pocket on your smartphone. And at some point, you of course want to show your credential. You want to present it to someone, for example, as part of an application process. So Alexander already mentioned this. We have, of course, developed some standardized software as part of this project. And one of these artifacts is the core verifier software. So this software is more or less a standard VC verifier. So all of our VCs also run through normal vanilla verifier software, but we have some additional steps. For example, this identity link that Alexander talked about in the beginning. You of course need to verify a software who is aware of this link to actually be able to also actively validate this link. So this is why we have this software. And we of course have built it into different interfaces. So for example, for very quick testing and development, we have a command line interface, very handy, but probably not what the average end user would use. Then we have an HTTP API, so you can just set up the service and interact with it through a standard HTTP API. It's just VC API, which is a global standard for this. And this is probably the most useful way of integrating this into institutions. And then, of course, mainly right now for demonstration purposes, but also potentially interesting in the future for smaller companies, is web-based verifier front-end. And of course, finally, last but not least, we did not develop these extensions here, third-party integrations, because that is out of scope for us, but probably in most cases in the future, big companies big institutions, big universities will of course want to integrate digital credentials directly into their systems to really make it more usable for everyone, be it learners or administrative staff. So now I have a quick impression video for you of a use case of someone who wants to apply at the DAAD. So we have an integration here into their SAP portal. And on the right side, you can see a test wallet software, which we have used during software development as an easier replacement for quick testing compared to a phone-based wallet. And you can just see that you start by more or less normally entering all your information, creating an account, and then in the end you will see how relatively simply you can just beam in your credentials via QR code or comparison link and craft a user experience that is very intuitive and very frictionless. So now we get to this point where it's time to upload verifiable credentials, and you can just see it generates a QR code there. So if you were using a mobile phone wallet, you would scan that code. But here in our case, for development purposes, we directly use the link encoded in that QR code to connect to this web-based wallet. All right. So let's look a bit more about this process, because what you've just seen is the presentation process. It's what Alexander has already talked about from a conceptual level, this process of actually having to generate this verifiable presentation. And we have completely hidden it behind this QR code, basically. So there is a protocol behind it that automatically initiates the exchange as soon as you scan it with your mobile phone wallet. And then they will automatically exchange requests. So the service endpoint here will tell the app what kinds of credentials it's looking for. You will be prompted on the app and can then send your credentials in. This is basically what we have seen with the web wallet in the video before. And of course, now that the credentials are in the system, next step is verifying them, actually being able to work with them. And as I've already said, in most future use cases we envision, this will probably be built into software already run at an institution. So student information software, or maybe a company SAP system, all of that will just be built into it. But here, for the sake of demonstration and accessibility, we have our web-based verifier. And you can see here that a presentation has been accepted there. And you can see that the presentation contains multiple credentials, 3, and the first 2 are valid, and the last one is not valid, unfortunately. So we can also distinguish between validity of different credentials within the same presentation. And we can then go into more detail. Here, for example, we have the overview of a TUM-issued diploma. And we can see on the left, there is some rudimentary rendering of it. This is just supposed to help you as a human who is used to looking at, of course, either physical degrees or degrees in PDF form to get a quick overview of what this is. And we generate all of this out of the actual credential data, so we can make sure we have one single source of truth for our data, and we can never have any mismatch between the rendering and the actual data in the credential. Yeah, we have this preview rendering. We have on the right side some relatively detailed information regarding the verification. it's a whole nother debate for itself in the end, how much you would actually show a real end user. This is probably overkill, but from a technical perspective, it's of course very interesting. So you can see the issuer identity there, and you can see that it was verified against a registry of trusted issuers. You can see the holder identity, and what this means, this linked ID, is that also an identity credential was contained in this presentation, and they were verified against each other. So we now know for sure that this diploma is linked to the student Lucas Lerner. And here we can see set identity credential. So this is just the sole identity data. You remember Alexander talked about separation of concerns. So we have two separate credentials here that are linked, and our special verifier software actually knows to look for that link and will specifically validate this. Here you can see an example of an invalid credential. For example, we don't even render a preview for an invalid credential, just to make it very clear that none of the data in that should be trusted, and you really should not use it in any way. And finally, here you can also see an achievement credential, which is a credential for a MOOC from OpenHPI. And this looks very similar. You can also see OpenHPI is registered as a trusted issuer. You can see the link ID to the student identity data. And also, I want to highlight here, we have an array here of checks. So you can see in a very detailed manner here what went wrong if verification fails. Before coming to an end on my part here, I want to talk a bit about quick technical challenges. I know not everyone in the audience here is super technical, so I want to keep it fairly high level, more high level than this diagram makes it look, and maybe also just give you an intuition of where the remaining technical challenges are still lying. So this, for example, here is our presentation protocol, what actually happens when you use the app to scan this QR code requesting your credentials. And there are standards for these HTTP-based communications, but VC API, which is probably right now the prevalent VC standard there, is also not really there where it needs to be. It's a good starting point, but things like our multi-device flow, it's not really a core thought behind the API design. So we actually had to struggle a bit and be creative in how we assemble the existing VC API packets into a protocol that works for this use case. So that shows there is still work to be done, and not every API standard, of course, has yet, or maybe ever can, take into account all of the required use cases that will emerge. Then, of course, I briefly already referenced it when we looked at the verification part. You need to know who you trust to issue certificates. It's a very fundamental problem, and it's probably at least as much an organizational, a governance problem as it is a technical problem. So early on, for example, the Learner Credential Wallet that we have shown throughout this started out with a built-in list, a static list of trusted issuers. That's, of course, pretty limiting. You can't just simply update this. You always have to push an entire app update. Then, and now it's running on a maintained list of public trusted hosts, which is already a lot better because now you can update the list independently from the app. But what we have experimented with, for example, is taking this another step further and saying, okay, what if we have a maintained publicly hosted list that also allows hierarchy comparable to what TLS web certificates do, that you can delegate the authority to host a list of trusted entities. So, for example, you could say there is a German authority who delegates down to the state levels, and then the states can keep lists of trusted universities within the state. And all of that is still in somewhat early form, and there is still some room to improve these systems, to make sure they are security hardened. And yeah, the other interesting aspect here I want to briefly mention is somewhat clear or a somewhat quick thought there is, if I'm already doing management of these institutions, of essentially their identity, why not just also chuck in something like accreditation? Who is authorized also to issue what types of degrees, for example? We have come to the conclusion that that is probably not that good of an idea, because the identity management itself is already a complex problem, and the authorization management, which this accreditation issue basically is also very interesting on the verifier side. For example, we should probably explore if we shouldn't limit verifiers in what data they are even allowed to request. So certain entities might not need a very large, broad profile of data from us. So it might make sense to restrict what data they can even request from the get-go. And then, of course, there are already a lot of accreditation efforts, and that data could probably be reused and just integrated into the system a lot easier if it doesn't have to be combined with trusted issuer management. And finally, credential status. We, of course, need to have the opportunity to revoke credentials. There might be simple orthographic errors, for example, in a name. There might be some more serious issues concerning fraud, and we need some way of quickly, privacy-preservingly revoking existing degrees or MOOCs or whatever else might be issued in the future. And to that end, we have also rethought the existing standard of status lists, which right now is completely web-based and on a per-issuer basis, and brought it more into the design space of decentralized identifiers, which have this middleware approach of giving you the freedom of mixing and matching more or less the infrastructures you want to use and the methods you want to use. And we have done something similar with credential lists to allow anyone issuing, so mainly academic institutions, to maintain a registry or a status list on any medium that they would desire. And for our testing, we have, for example, implemented something web-based, of course, like the existing standard, and something based on Ethereum. So completely different worlds. And it all just works through the magic of middleware. All right, then I hope this was somewhat interesting. And at this point, I would love to hand over to Professor Meinel for some closing words and some more perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to embed this technical stuff a little bit into a broader picture, which of course is characterized by the subtitle of this conference, by the digitalization, which is changing how we work, which is changing how we live, it's changing how we communicate, and of course it's changing how we learn and teach. Of course, this is clear for all, but if you look to some of the actual figures, for example in Germany, that there is a lack of specialists. Almost 750,000 people are missing, which are needed for pushing forward economy, social life and social work. what we see is that the number of technology-related degree programs in Germany tripled since not even 5 years. Not even 5 years, and it was a time where it was difficult with Corona. Upskilling and reskilling of employees in companies is a very central task. So we had discussions with Volkswagen, and they explained, oh, we need to train and to perform all our mechanic people into IT people. This characterizes that when we want to and manage to do this, we need the digital technologies also for the digital technologies also for learning. So each kind of learning, particularly higher education, has to change. Here's a question mark, but has to change. There are new people that need to be taught, also in the higher education, particularly older people, because digitalization also has an effect that our knowledge in the world is exploding. There's an exponential increase. This is a larger number of people, 8 billion. There is this digital technologies and the communication between the scientists and the databases and the communication media that help that the knowledge is increasing, so it's no more enough like 30 or 50 years ago that I go to a university when I am a young person and then I have learned enough for all my professional life. No, the people have to change the content of their professional life in future 3-4 times during their work time. So this needs that study programs need to be much faster designed and implemented. And not all of you came from Germany, but German universities are over-regulated. To come with a new study program is a more years problem and approach. So it is not easy to come with new study content and study programs and new teaching content. And also some skills are needed that were not trained in the past. We call it future skills. So to give some keywords, design thinking, to be more open-minded, to learn to interact with people from other disciplines, to establish more flexible research studies. All this is a first step into this new world to broadly provide knowledge are MOOCs. For many people, they think the massiveness of the MOOCs is the important thing. No, this is not the important. The important thing is the S, which is not part of it's the social factor. MOOC provides a possibility when there are many people take part in the MOOC, learn in the same time, week or month, the same content. Then providing social media functionalities, the people start, like in a classroom, to interact with each other. To interact with the professor is a little bit, only a few students are doing this. But to interact with a classmate, this is all done during the lecture, after the lecture, doing the homework. And MOOCs provides this possibility. Many people learn, it is not organized, it comes from the structure of this course work, and so they deal and learn the same content, and there comes up a lot of questions, and then they start, do you know what you mean? I didn't understand, or I know it better. So this is what MOOCs provide, and it is a model which you see is very broadly distributed in the world. Here are some figures about the global development of MOOC platforms. With our platform, we celebrated a month ago the 10 years of OpenHPI. The OpenHPI platform itself is used from HPI, but the platform is also used from, you saw it, from World Health Organization, from SAP. So last week, more than 15 million people were enrolled in the Open HPI platform from the different providers. Here you see the huge number of students, and students means not necessarily students of a university. Better to call it learner, because what we see with Open HPI, the age of the students, of the main part of the student, is between 35 and 60. The students, the young people, they have time to go to the university. It's important to go to university, to get a network, to be in a first socialized period out from home, out from the family. But for the people which are in a profession, which are working, which have a family, it's not possible to go in a traditional lecture or university. It's much too big change in their life. So now they can do this in parallel, in the night, on the weekend, and you see from the huge number, from the 220 million that are prognosticated that take part anywhere globally in such a MOOC course, that there is a really understanding that it is a very well-fitting format to learn. And this is what we try to develop Open HPI in future. We think it's time for completely virtual universities or digital universities. So we developed a project, Universitas Digitales, which is offered completely online. The idea behind it is not a competition to the traditional universities. They deal with the young people. But the traditional universities, at least in Germany, it's a little bit different in the US, have not found a way to teach, to provide content for lifelong learning. There are a few exceptions. There are some universities that provide something, but it does not fit to the structure of the university as it is today. And in this sense, we believe that here is really a need. We come from the huge number of people that take part in MOOCs. And there is a will that people which get professional experience also like to have a formal degree, not only these informal degrees that you can get from MOOCs, the certificates, where it's not clear how to compare to each other, but here in the formal way to get a degree program, MBA, master, or others. We also, in this concept, see and think that it's possible to organize research in the research groups on a virtual basis. In a virtual university, it's no more necessary that the professors are in the same place. They can stay in the world where they are staying, and they can do their research there with their PhD students, with their scientific co-workers. But they have to interact with other professors and with other PhD students and others. And technical means are there. Of course, MOOCs is only something which is comparable to the lectures. A university program provides a lot of other formats to learn, to debate, to do common projects and others. But also these types of formats can be simulated digitally. So in Open HPI we have a large research group, and a lot of learning formats, teaching formats are developed so that we believe we can establish a complete university in the digital world. And for that, at the end, you need credentials. And exactly this is what brings us together with his partners, with his international partners, the group which is led by MIT, which needs technical work to implement this idea that you can get credentials, that you can show this, that you can present it, that you can exchange this. And in this way, to offer the possibility that you also, like DAAD is doing a lot, to bring, to support students' mobility. But if the offer and the university, the complete university is digital, then it's not at all a problem to increase this mobility and to lift this mobility. So this is our idea, and I hope we can implement it during the next years. Thank you for listening, and there were some here, some information. Eventually, you could also fit into your programs, in your universities, in your teaching organizations, propagate for your students. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have some, for example, magic of middleware. My goodness, why did we not come up with this line beforehand? Ask away is a bit optimistic because I think there's only about 2 minutes for various different rooms and there's a lot going on. But if there's any burning questions, I'm sure the group will be happy to take them.
Eventually, one remark. You do not know nothing about middleware. You can trust this top, also more project workers. This is like to look into the car. What you want to do is to drive the car. It's not necessary to understand the motor, but the motor needs to be constructed in the right way.
So middleware is not that magical after all. Okay, I know now.
You need it, but you should not see it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, we'll give it a little round of applause.